There are moments in life when the ordinary world splits wide open, and you realize nothing will ever be the same again. For Grace Mitchell, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon in a hospital corridor in Philadelphia, under lights that buzzed too loud and smelled like bleach and dying flowers. Her grandmother had been slipping away for 3 days, and Grace had been holding her hand through every ragged breath, every moment of pain that morphed into something harder to watch than any 24-year-old should have to witness. The bills were already piling up. Grace knew this. She'd known it before they even called the ambulance. In America, dying costs money. Living costs money. Everything costs money. And Grace had stopped having any 6 months ago when the restaurant where she worked went under and her landlord raised the rent, and suddenly Philadelphia wasn't the city of brotherly love anymore. It was just another place where you could drown quietly while everyone else kept moving. Her grandmother whispered something in those final hours. Grace leaned close, past the tubes and monitors, past the machinery keeping her tethered to this world. The old woman's fingers, thin as bird bones, gripped Grace's wrist with surprising strength. "Find him," she said. "The man with the rose on his wrist. Tell him it was my biggest regret. Before we go on, tell us, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below." Grace didn't understand. Her grandmother's mind had been wandering for days, slipping between decades like channels on a broken television. But she repeated it 3 more times before her breathing changed, before the machines started their final song, before Grace became an orphan in every sense that mattered. After the funeral, a modest affair that Grace paid for with a credit card she'd never be able to clear, she found herself in her grandmother's apartment in South Philly. The place smelled like lavender and old paper, like every memory Grace had of safety before the world got hard. She went through drawers and boxes, looking for something she couldn't name, until she found the photographs. They were hidden in a hat box under the bed. Black and white images from another era, from an America that existed before Grace was born. And there he was, in a photo dated 1968, a young man with dark eyes and darker hair, leaning against a car on a street corner that could have been anywhere. His sleeve was rolled up. On his wrist, clear as day, was a tattoo of a rose. On the back, in her grandmother's handwriting, asterisk the one who got away. The one I should have stayed with. My biggest regret, asterisk. Grace's hands trembled. She turned the photo over again, studying his face. He would be old now, if he was even still alive. But something in her chest told her to look, told her this mattered, told her that her grandmother's dying words weren't just fever dreams. She started searching. Reverse image searches led nowhere. The internet had limits when it came to ghosts from 1968. But Grace had grown up in Philadelphia, and she knew how to ask questions in the right neighborhoods. She showed the photo in corner stores and old barbershops, in places where men her grandfather's age played chess and remembered when the city was different. It took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of dead ends and suspicious looks and people closing doors in her face. Until finally, an old man in a coffee shop in Fishtown looked at the photo and went pale. "That's Caleb Reeves," he said quietly. "But you don't want to find him, girl. You don't want anything to do with that family." Grace felt her heart kick against her ribs. "Why not?" The old man looked around the coffee shop like shadows might be listening. "Because the Reeves family runs half the city. Always has. And Caleb is the one who runs them. You understand what I'm saying?" She understood. She understood, and she didn't care. Because dying costs money in America, and Grace had $47,000 in medical debt from 3 days in a hospital, and her grandmother had asked her for one thing before leaving this world. The old man gave her an address. A restaurant in Old City, upscale, the kind of place Grace couldn't afford to breathe near. He told her Caleb ate dinner there every Thursday. He told her she was making a mistake. Grace went anyway. The restaurant was all dark wood and soft lighting, the kind of place where the prices weren't on the menu and everyone spoke in voices that didn't carry. Grace wore the only dress she owned that didn't have a stain on it, the one she'd worn to job interviews that never called back. She felt like an imposter, like someone who'd wandered onto the wrong movie set. She asked the hostess if Caleb Reeves was dining there tonight. The woman's expression changed instantly, a subtle shift from polite to wary. And you are? Someone with a message, Grace said. From his past. It's important. The hostess made a phone call. Grace waited, her heart doing things hearts aren't supposed to do, wild and arrhythmic. She thought about leaving. She thought about running back to her one-bedroom apartment where the heat barely worked and pretending this day never happened. Then a man appeared. Not old, like she'd expected. Middle-aged, maybe 50, with silver threading through dark hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen every version of human nature and weren't impressed by any of it. He wore a suit that probably cost more than Grace's car had when it still ran. On his wrist, just visible beneath the cuff of his shirt, was a tattoo of a rose. He looked at her the way you'd look at something unexpected and possibly dangerous. "You asked for me," he said. His voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of voice that didn't need to rise to command a room. Grace pulled out the photograph. Her hands shook. She hated that they shook, but they did anyway. "My grandmother," she said. "Eleanor Mitchell. She passed away 2 weeks ago. She told me to find you. She said to tell you that you were her biggest regret." Caleb Reeves went very still, the kind of still that predators go before they strike. He took the photograph from her hands, and for a moment, something crossed his face that looked almost human, almost vulnerable. Then it was gone, locked away behind walls Grace could sense but not see. "Come with me," he said. It wasn't a request. He led her through the restaurant to a private room in the back, past tables where men in expensive suits stopped their conversations to watch her pass. Grace felt their eyes like physical weight. She felt the shift in atmosphere, the way the air got thicker with each step. The private room was elegant and claustrophobic at once. Caleb gestured to a chair. Grace Saturday. He remained standing, the photograph still in his hand, his eyes fixed on that image from 1968. "Eleanor," he said softly. The name sounded different in his mouth, like a prayer or a wound that never healed. She was everything good in this world once, and I was everything wrong. Grace waited. She'd learned in her 24 years that sometimes silence was the only question that mattered. "I loved her," Caleb continued. "I would have burned this entire city down for her. But she was smart, smarter than me. She knew what being with me would mean. So she left. Married someone safe, someone good, someone who wasn't me." He finally looked at Grace, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that scared her more than anger would have. "You're her granddaughter," he said. "Yes. You look like her. Same eyes, same way of holding your shoulders like the weight of the world hasn't bent you yet." He paused. "But it will. This city breaks everyone eventually." Grace thought about her debt, her empty bank account, her grandmother's funeral she'd never be able to pay off. "I'm already breaking." Something shifted in Caleb's expression, a calculation happening behind his eyes, a decision being made in real time. "How much do you owe?" The question caught her off guard. "What?" "The medical bills. From Eleanor's final days." "How much?" Grace's throat went tight. "I don't." "How much?" 4,000 to 7,000, she whispered. "Give or take." Caleb pulled out his phone, made a call, spoke numbers and account details in a voice that expected obedience. When he hung up, he looked at Grace with an expression she couldn't read. "It's paid," he said. The room tilted. Grace gripped the edge of the table. "I can't." "You can't refuse," Caleb said quietly. "I owed Eleanor Mitchell a debt I could never repay. Let me pay yours instead." "Nothing is free," Grace said. She'd lived in America long enough to know that truth bone deep. Caleb smiled, and it was the saddest thing Grace had ever seen. "You're right," he said. "Nothing is free. So here's what you owe me. Stay. For a while. Let me make sure you're safe, that you're taken care of. Eleanor would have wanted that." "For how long?" "Until I say." And there it was, the cage presenting itself as salvation. The trap dressed up as kindness. Grace felt it closing around her even as relief flooded her chest at the thought of that debt disappearing, at the promise of safety in a city that had shown her none. She should have said no. She should have walked away. But $4,000 to $7,000 was 4 to 7,000 reasons why she couldn't. Okay, Grace said. Caleb nodded once, decisive. Someone will collect you tomorrow. Bring what matters. Leave the rest. He left the room, taking the photograph with him, and Grace sat alone in the elegant prison of a private dining room, wondering what she'd just agreed to, wondering if her grandmother's biggest regret was about to become Hayes too. Outside, Philadelphia kept moving, kept breathing, kept being the kind of city where ordinary lives split open and nothing was ever the same again. The car that came for Grace the next morning was black and gleaming, the kind that whispered money so old it didn't need to shout. It idled outside her apartment building in South Philly like a sleek animal among the rusted sedans and dented pickup trucks that lined the street. Grace watched it from her window, her single duffel bag packed with everything that mattered. Some clothes, her grandmother's photographs, a book she'd been reading for 6 months but never finished because exhaustion was its own kind of illiteracy. The driver didn't speak when she climbed in. He was young, maybe 30, with the kind of build that suggested he spent more time in gyms than most people spent sleeping. His eyes found her in the rearview mirror once, then focused forward with the discipline of someone who knew the cost of curiosity. They drove north, out of the neighborhoods Grace knew, through Center City with its tourists and its gleaming commerce, past the museums and the river, into an area where the streets got quieter and the houses got larger and the whole character of Philadelphia shifted into something Grace had only ever seen from bus windows when she was going somewhere she couldn't afford to stop. The estate sat behind gates that opened like a mouth swallowing her whole. The house beyond was brick and stone and old money, the kind of structure that had probably stood there since before Grace's grandmother was born, watching the city change around it while remaining unchanged itself. Trees lined the driveway, the branches creating shadows that moved across the windshield like warnings. Grace felt her pulse in her throat. The driver opened her door. Grace stepped out onto gravel that crunched beneath her sneakers, the only sound in a silence that felt deliberate. Another man appeared, older, gray-haired, wearing a suit despite the early hour. He introduced himself as Richard, the house manager, and his tone was polite but carried the same wariness Grace had seen in the restaurant hostess's eyes. "Mr. Reeves is conducting business this morning," Richard said. "He'll see you this evening. For now, let me show you to your room." Her room, as if she'd be staying in one place, as if this was temporary. Grace followed Richard through doors that felt too heavy, down hallways lined with art that probably cost more than Grace's entire life, up a staircase that curved like a question mark. The room he showed her to was larger than her entire apartment had been. Windows overlooked grounds that stretched toward trees, toward sky, toward nothing Grace recognized. There was a bed that looked like it belonged in a hotel where presidents slept, a bathroom with marble and fixtures that gleamed, a closet that echoed when she opened it. "Lunch will be brought to you at noon," Richard said. "If you need anything, there's a phone by the bed. Dial 0. Then he left, and Grace stood in the center of that enormous room, her duffel bag a small and pathetic thing against the thick carpet, and felt the door closing on her old life like a chapter ending mid-sentence. She went to the window. From up here, she could see the walls that surrounded the property. High, stone, topped with something that might have been decorative ironwork or might have been something else. She couldn't see the gate from this angle, couldn't see the street beyond, couldn't see any of Philadelphia she recognized. Safety, Caleb had promised, until he said otherwise. Grace wondered what the difference was between protection and imprisonment. She wondered if her grandmother had stood in a room like this once, looking out at a world she couldn't reach, wondering the same thing. The days that followed blurred together in a way that time had never blurred before. Grace woke in that enormous bed, ate meals that appeared like clockwork, wandered the halls of a house too big for the silence that filled it. She saw Caleb only in passing, a glimpse of him through a doorway, the sound of his voice from behind closed doors, the awareness that he knew where she was even when she couldn't see him. There were others in the house. Men who moved with purpose, who spoke in low voices, who looked at Grace the way you'd look at something fragile that might break if handled wrong. She learned not to ask questions. She learned that curiosity was a luxury she couldn't afford. At night, lying in that bed that felt like floating, Grace stared at the ceiling and thought about freedom. Real freedom, not the American kind that came with debt and fear and working yourself into dust just to keep breathing. She'd been free in her old life, technically. Free to drown, free to fail, free to watch her grandmother die while bills multiplied like cancer cells. Here, she had everything. Food appeared. Her clothes were laundered. The heat worked. Nobody called about money she owed. And yet she couldn't remember the last time she'd chosen what time to eat dinner. 2 weeks passed before Caleb called for her. Richard appeared at her door one evening, his expression neutral. "Mr. Reeves would like you to join him for dinner." Grace's stomach dropped. She'd been both dreading and hoping for this moment, the way you dread and hope for a wound to finally be addressed. She followed Richard down through the house to a dining room that could have seated 20 but held only 2 place settings, one at each end of a table long enough to echo. Caleb was already there, standing by a window, his back to her. He wore casual clothes, jeans, a dark shirt, but they fit him the way expensive things always fit people who understand their worth. When he turned, Grace saw exhaustion in his face that hadn't been there before. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the closer chair. Grace Saturday. She noticed he moved his chair down the table, closing the distance between them until they were sitting across from each other like people having an actual conversation rather than shouting across a void. Dinner was brought by staff who appeared and disappeared like ghosts. Steak, vegetables, bread that was still warm. Grace ate because not eating felt like surrender, but everything tasted like air. "You're settling in," Caleb said. It wasn't a question. "I'm here," Grace replied. "I don't know if that's the same thing." Something almost like approval crossed his face. "You're honest." Eleanor was honest too. "It's a rare quality in my world." "What is your world?" Grace asked. "Nobody will tell me anything." Caleb cut into his steak with precision. "It's better that way." "Better for who?" "For you." Grace set down her fork. "I'm not a child. I'm not stupid. I know who you are, what you are. The whole city knows. So why pretend?" Caleb looked at her for a long moment, and Grace felt the weight of that gaze, the calculation behind it. Then he did something she didn't expect. He smiled. "You're right," he said. "You're not a child, and you're definitely not stupid." He leaned back in his chair. "My family has run Satan operations in Philadelphia for 3 generations. We move money, we manage territory, we solve problems that the police can't or won't. It's not legal, it's not moral, but it's what I was born into, and it's what I'm good at." The honesty was startling. Grace had expected denial, deflection, the kind of careful language people use when they don't want to admit what everyone already knows. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you asked," Caleb said simply, "and because lies are exhausting. I've been lying my whole life about what I am, what I do, to banks, to politicians, to every civilian who looks at me and sees a successful businessman instead of what I actually am. I'm tired of it." Grace felt something shift in her understanding of him. He wasn't what she expected. None of this was. "Your grandmother saw through me from the beginning," Caleb continued. His voice went softer, touched by memory. "I tried to hide it from her, tried to pretend I was something better, but Eleanor looked at me one day and said, 'I know what you are, and I'm leaving before it destroys us both.'" "Was she right?" Grace asked. "Yes," Caleb said without hesitation. "She was right about everything. I would have pulled her down into this world, and eventually it would have killed her, or worse, turned her into someone like me." He paused. Her leaving was the most loving thing she ever did. Grace thought about her grandmother, about the woman who raised her after Grace's parents died, who worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, who never complained even when the weight of the world pressed down on her thin shoulders. She never stopped loving you, Grace said quietly. All those years, she kept your picture, wrote on the back that you were her biggest regret. Regret that she left, or regret that she loved me at all? Does it matter? Caleb's expression went distant. No, I suppose it doesn't. They finished dinner in silence that felt less hostile than before. When the plates were cleared, Caleb stood. You're safe here, he said. I need you to understand that. Whatever happens outside these walls, inside them, you're protected. What's happening outside these walls? Nothing you need to worry about. But the way he said it made Grace worry anyway. That night, alone in her room, Grace stood at the window and looked out at the grounds bathed in moonlight. Somewhere beyond those walls was the Philadelphia she knew. The struggle, the chaos, the freedom that came with poverty. Here, she had comfort she'd never imagined. Here, she was safe. Here, she was a bird in a gilded cage, and the door had just locked behind her. If this story has already found a place in your heart, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and check the description box below for more stories that stay long after they end. Time moved differently inside the estate. Days folded into each other like pages in a book read too quickly, each one indistinguishable from the last. Grace woke when light filtered through curtains she never remembered closing. She ate meals prepared by hands she never saw. She walked grounds that stretched on but always ended at walls. 3 weeks became 4. 4 became 5. The math of her captivity, because that's what it was. Grace had stopped pretending otherwise, accumulated in her bones. She tried to establish routines, small rebellions against the formlessness. Morning walks around the garden, though the same paths led to the same walls. Afternoons in the library, though she couldn't focus long enough to finish a chapter. Evenings watching the news on a television that showed her a Philadelphia she could no longer touch, a world that kept spinning without her. Caleb was a ghost in those weeks. She caught glimpses, his silhouette in a hallway, his voice behind doors that stayed closed, the way the house seemed to breathe differently when he was home versus when he wasn't. The staff moved around his presence the way planets orbit a star, pulled by gravity they couldn't escape. Grace found herself thinking about him more than she wanted to admit. Not in the way she'd thought about boys in college, before her parents died and college became an impossible dream. This was different. Darker. The kind of attention you pay to something dangerous, the way you can't stop touching a bruise to see if it still hurts. She learned the house's rhythms. Richard appeared every morning with coffee and questions about what she needed. The cleaning staff came Tuesdays and Fridays, silent women who never met her eyes. Guards changed shifts at 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., men with faces carved from stone who stood at doors and watched things Grace couldn't see. It was a Thursday afternoon, rain turning the windows into rivers, when Grace finally broke. She found Richard in his office off the main hall, a room organized with the precision of someone who controlled chaos for a living. I need to leave, she said without preamble. Richard looked up from his computer, his expression unchanged. Leave where? Here. The house. I need to go outside, even just for an hour. I need to see something that isn't these walls. That's not possible. Why not? Mr. Reeves has been clear about your safety. My safety or my imprisonment? Grace's voice rose despite herself. I haven't breathed outside air in 5 weeks. I haven't seen another human being who isn't paid to be here. This isn't protection, it's a cage. Richard's expression finally shifted, something almost like sympathy crossing his features. I understand your frustration. No, you don't. You get to leave. You have a life outside these walls. I have nothing. I **** nothing here. That's not true. Isn't it? Grace felt something breaking inside her, all the silence and acceptance cracking open. Tell me what I am then. Guest? Prisoner? Debt to be kept until Caleb decides I've paid enough for his guilt over my grandmother. You're under his protection, Richard said carefully. In his world, that means something. In my world, it means I'm suffocating. Richard studied her for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He picked up the phone on his desk and made a call. The conversation was brief, quiet. When he hung up, he looked at Grace with an expression she couldn't read. "Someone will be up to see you shortly," he said. Grace returned to her room, her heart doing wild things in her chest. She'd pushed, and now she'd face whatever came from pushing. She thought about her grandmother, about how Eleanor had pushed away from Caleb all those years ago, choosing survival over love. Maybe Grace had inherited that instinct. Maybe it ran in their blood, the ability to see cages even when they looked like palaces. 30 minutes later, there was a knock on her door. Grace opened it to find Caleb standing in the hallway, still in the suit he must have worn to whatever business consumed his days. He looked tired. He looked dangerous. He looked at her like she was a problem he was trying to solve. "Walk with me," he said. It wasn't a request. Grace followed him through the house and out through a side door she'd never noticed before. Rain had stopped, leaving everything wet and gleaming. They walked across the grounds toward the far wall, past gardens that were probably beautiful when Grace could appreciate such things. Caleb didn't speak until they reached a small greenhouse tucked against the trees. Inside, it smelled like earth and growing things, warm despite the cooling autumn air outside. He gestured to a bench. "They Saturday. Richard says you want to leave," Caleb said. "I need to leave," Grace corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes. Want implies choice. Need implies survival." Caleb almost smiled. "You sound like her. Eleanor. She used to argue with me like that, breaking down my words until I couldn't hide behind them anymore." "Did it work?" "Sometimes. When I let it." He paused. "What do you think you'd find out there that you don't have here?" Grace looked at him directly. "Freedom. Choice. My life." "Your life was drowning in debt and dying alone in a city that didn't care if you existed." The words hit like a slap. Grace felt anger rise hot in her throat. "At least it was mine. At least I chose my own drowning." "There's no nobility in suffering, Grace. There's no dignity in golden handcuffs either." They sat in silence, surrounded by plants that grew because they had no choice, because roots didn't come with agency. Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes and hated herself for it, hated that she was breaking in front of him. "Why me?" she asked finally. "Why did you really take me in? Was it just guilt over my grandmother, or is it something else?" Caleb was quiet for so long Grace thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice carried something Grace had never heard in it before: vulnerability. "I was 17 when I met Eleanor. She was 19, working in a diner in South Philly, putting herself through nursing school. She had this way of moving through the world like it owed her nothing and she expected nothing from it. She was the most honest person I'd ever met." He stayed at his hands. "I loved her the way you love something you know you'll lose. Desperately. Destructively." Grace waited. "My father was building the family business then. Making moves, taking territory, doing things that required violence and fear. I was learning from him, becoming what he needed me to be. Eleanor saw all of it, and one day she looked at me and said, 'You have to choose, this life or me. You can't have both.' What did you choose?" "I didn't," Caleb said. "I tried to have both. Tried to keep her safe while building an empire. But she was smarter than me. She left before I could destroy her." He finally looked at Grace. "When you showed up with that photograph, when you told me her last words, I saw a chance at redemption I didn't deserve. You're her blood, her legacy. If I can protect you, keep you safe from the world that took her from me, maybe it means something." "Maybe it means you're still trying to own something you can't have," Grace said quietly. Caleb's expression hardened. "Is that what you think this is?" "I don't know what this is. That's the problem." They sat in the greenhouse as light faded outside, and Grace felt the weight of understanding settling between them. He wasn't her captor out of cruelty. He was her captor out of love for a woman who'd been gone for decades, out of guilt that never healed, out of a need to protect something that reminded him of what he'd lost. It didn't make it right, but it made it human. "I need to breathe," Grace said finally. "I need to walk on streets, see strangers, remember what it feels like to be a person in the world instead of a ghost in a mansion. It's not safe." "I don't care." Caleb studied her, some internal war playing out behind his eyes. Then he nodded, once, sharp, supervised. "You go with guards. You don't leave their sight. And you come back." "Is that a threat?" "It's reality. My enemies would use you to get to me. Do you understand what that means?" Grace thought about it, about what he was admitting, that keeping her here wasn't just about control, it was about genuine danger. That the walls weren't just to keep her in, they were to keep something else out. "I understand," she said. "Tomorrow," Caleb said, "Richard will arrange it. A few hours. Center City. Somewhere public." It wasn't freedom, but it was something. A crack in the cage. Grace felt hope flutter in her chest like a bird she'd thought was dead. If you've ever felt torn between fear and love, you'll understand her. Remember to like, comment, subscribe, and check the description box below. Your support keeps stories like this alive. They walked back to the house as evening turned to night, and Grace felt the distance between them shrink in a way that scared her. Because understanding your captor was the first step toward forgiving them. And forgiveness was the first step toward something Grace didn't have a name for yet. The car that took Grace into Philadelphia the next day was different from the one that had brought her to the estate. This one had windows tinted so dark the world outside looked like a film negative. 2 guards sat in front, the driver whose name Grace never learned, and a man called Hayes who had the kind of eyes that saw everything and revealed nothing. Grace sat in back, watching her city scroll past like memories. They took routes she recognized, then one she didn't. South Philly looked different through tinted glass, like a place she'd dreamed once but never actually lived. The neighborhoods got cleaner as they moved toward Center City, the row homes giving way to converted lofts, the corner stores replaced by coffee shops with names that suggested comfort nobody could actually afford. They parked near Rittenhouse Square, where the trees were turning colors that meant winter was coming. Hayes opened her door, and Grace stepped out into October air that tasted like freedom and car exhaust. She'd forgotten how loud the world was. Traffic and voices and the constant hum of a city that never stopped moving. 2 hours, Hayes said. His voice was flat, professional. "Stay where we can see you. Don't talk to anyone we haven't cleared. When time's up, we'll leave." Grace nodded. She wanted to argue, to push for more, but 2 hours was 2 hours more than she'd had in 5 weeks. She'd take what she could get. She walked. Just walked, with no destination, no purpose except to move through space that wasn't defined by walls. Hayes and the other guard followed at a distance, trying to look casual and failing. Nobody looked casual when they moved like that, when their hands stayed near their jackets the way hands stayed near weapons. The square was full of people living ordinary lives. Mothers with strollers, old men playing chess, students from the universities spread across blankets with textbooks they weren't reading. Grace felt like an anthropologist observing a species she used to belong to, trying to remember the customs. She sat on a bench near the fountain. The water moved in patterns, up and down, the sound of it almost meditative. A woman sat on the next bench over, maybe 60, feeding pigeons from a bag of breadcrumbs. She looked at Grace with the kind smile strangers share sometimes in cities where loneliness is the most common condition. "Beautiful day," the woman said. Grace nodded. "It is. You look like you haven't seen the sun in a while." The observation was too accurate. Grace felt exposed, like the stranger could see through skin to the truth underneath. "I've been sick," Grace lied. "Just getting out again." "Well, good for you," the woman said. "My husband, before he passed, he used to say that every day you get to breathe outside air is a day to be grateful for, even when everything else is falling apart." Grace felt something tighten in her chest. He sounds wise. He was stubborn and difficult and drove me crazy for 40 years, the woman said with a laugh. But yes, sometimes he was wise. They sat in comfortable silence. The pigeons pecked at breadcrumbs. The fountain kept cycling. Hayes watched from 15 feet away, his expression unreadable behind sunglasses. When the woman left, Grace stayed on the bench. She pulled out her phone. They'd returned it to her that morning, though Hayes had made it clear they'd be monitoring its use. No calls without approval. No messages to anyone from her old life. The device felt foreign in her hands, like a tool from another era. She opened social media, something she'd barely looked at in the weeks before her grandmother died, when exhaustion made scrolling feel like work. Her feed was full of people she used to know, living lives that had continued without her. Friends from high school getting married, having kids, complaining about jobs and weather and small dramas that seemed enormous in their worlds. Grace realized she didn't miss any of it. Not really. She'd been disconnected from that life long before Caleb took her in, back when poverty made socializing impossible and exhaustion made friendship a luxury she couldn't maintain. She closed the app, started walking again. There was a bookstore on a corner she used to pass sometimes, back when she worked near here, back when her life was measured in shifts and tips and the constant math of survival. She went inside. The smell hit her immediately. Paper and ink and the particular mustiness of old buildings repurposed for new dreams. Hayes followed her in, trying to look like a customer browsing. He picked up a book on military history and pretended to read it upside down. Grace almost smiled. She wandered the aisles, running her fingers along spines. Fiction, non-fiction, poetry, all these words all these people had put into the world hoping someone would find them meaningful. Grace pulled out a novel at random, read the first page. It was about a woman leaving her husband, driving west towards something unnamed. Grace put it back. At the checkout counter, a young man with tattoos up both arms was helping a customer. When the customer left, he looked at Grace with the easy friendliness of someone paid to be welcoming. Find everything okay? Just browsing, Grace said. Cool. Let me know if you need recommendations. I'm really into noir lately. Dark stuff, but good. Grace thought about her life, about the darkness she was currently browsing in. Maybe next time. She left the bookstore and walked toward the art museum, though she knew they'd never let her go inside. Too many exits, too many variables. But she could see it from the street, could watch tourists taking pictures on the steps, could remember being young and believing museums were places she'd have time for someday. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. Asterisk time to go. Asterisk. Grace looked around. Hayes was already moving toward her, subtle but definite. The 2 hours were up. Her furlough from the cage was over. On the drive back, Grace watched Philadelphia disappear behind them. She felt hollow, like the brief taste of freedom had only made the captivity sharper. She'd walked through her city like a ghost, untouchable and untouched, and now she was returning to walls that would feel smaller than before. When they arrived at the estate, Caleb was waiting in the main hall. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't name. Did it help? He asked. No, Grace said honestly. It made it worse. Something crossed his face, disappointment or understanding or both. I'm sorry. Are you? Yes. Grace believed him. That was the problem. She was starting to believe everything about him, starting to see past the danger to the man underneath who was just as trapped as she was, just in a cage of his own making. I have something to show you, Caleb said. If you're willing. Grace was tired of being willing, tired of following, tired of everything. But she nodded anyway because what else was there to do? He led her to a wing of the house she'd never seen before, down a hallway lined with paintings that probably belonged to museums, through a door that required a key only he had, into a room that took Grace's breath away. It was full of photographs, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, black and white images from decades past, covering every wall. And in all of them, in various stages of life, was her grandmother. Young Eleanor working at a diner. Eleanor laughing on a street corner. Eleanor at the beach, her hair wild with wind. Eleanor dancing in a club. Eleanor sleeping in a car. Eleanor looking at the camera with an expression that held the whole world in it. Grace moved through the room like walking through a dream. She'd seen some of these photos before, in her grandmother's hatbox. But most were new, intimate, the kind of images you only get when someone loves you enough to document your existence. "I've kept them all these years," Caleb said quietly. "Even after she left. Even after she made it clear there was no coming back. I couldn't let her go." Grace turned to him. "This isn't love. This is obsession." "Isn't all love obsession? Just with better PR." "Not like this." Caleb looked around the room, at all those frozen moments of a woman who'd chosen to leave him. "Maybe you're right. Maybe I've been sick with it for so long I can't tell the difference anymore." Grace felt something shift inside her. Not pity, exactly. Not forgiveness. But understanding of a particular kind of pain she recognized because she'd felt it too. The pain of loving something you couldn't have, couldn't keep, couldn't make stay no matter how hard you tried. "She still loved you," Grace said. At the end. That's what the regret meant. Not that she wished she'd stayed, but that she wished loving you hadn't hurt so much. Caleb closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. Grace had never seen him cry before. She didn't think he was capable of it. "I would have burned the world for her," he said. "I know," Grace said. That's exactly what she was afraid of. They stood in that room full of ghosts, surrounded by a life that existed only in images now, and Grace felt the walls of her understanding shifting. Caleb wasn't her villain. He was just a man who'd loved wrong and never learned how to love right, and now he was trying to protect the granddaughter of the woman he'd lost as if that could somehow make up for all the years of absence. If your heart's racing too, take a breath, and don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and check the description box below for more unforgettable love stories. It couldn't. Grace knew that. But the knowing didn't make it any less human, any less real, any less like looking in a mirror and seeing her own capacity for destructive devotion staring back. The night everything changed started like all the others. Grace ate dinner alone in the smaller dining room, the one she'd claimed as her space because the formal one felt too much like a cathedral built to worship money. Richard brought her wine she didn't ask for, told her Caleb would be away on business until late, left her to the silence that had become her most constant companion. She was reading, actually reading, for the first time in weeks, a novel about a woman who disappeared and the husband who may or may not have killed her, when she heard the sounds. Raised voices. Movement, fast and urgent. Something that might have been a crash or might have been a door slamming. Then silence that felt different from the usual silence, the kind that comes after violence instead of before it. Grace set down her book. Her heart was doing things hearts do when the body knows danger before the mind catches up. She went to her door, opened it carefully. The hallway was empty but wrong. Lights were off that should have been on. The air felt charged, like right before a thunderstorm when everything holds its breath. She heard footsteps, multiple sets, moving with purpose. Heard Richard's voice, sharp with command, "Lock it down. Now. Nobody in or out." Grace's first instinct was to hide, to go back to her room and pretend she was sleeping, pretend she was anywhere but here. Her second instinct was curiosity, the dangerous kind that killed cats and got people hurt. She followed the second instinct. She moved through the house using routes she'd memorized in her weeks of captivity. The servant stays that connected floors. The back hallways that let staff move unseen. She'd learned the architecture of her cage the way prisoners always do, mapping escapes she'd never attempt. The commotion was coming from the East Wing, where Caleb conducted business in rooms Grace was never allowed near. She got close enough to hear voices without being seen, crouched at the top of a stairwell like a child eavesdropping on adult conversations. Found him in the shipping yard. Someone talked. That was Hayes, his voice hard with something that might have been anger or fear or both. How many? Caleb. Grace recognized his voice even in rage, especially in rage. 3 of ours dead. 2 of theirs. They are sending a message. I know what they are sending. The question is what was sent back. Grace's stomach turned cold. She thought about those men she'd seen in the house, the ones who moved like soldiers, who watched things she couldn't see. She thought about them dead in a shipping yard somewhere in Philadelphia. The death's just business, just messages in a war she didn't understand. There's something else. Richard's voice, carefully neutral. They know about the girl. Silence. Grace felt it like pressure in her ears, like the moment before your head goes underwater. How? Caleb's voice was quiet now. Dangerous the way quiet things are dangerous. We're investigating. But they sent photos. Her at Rittenhouse yesterday. They are watching. Grace's hands went cold. She thought about the woman with the pigeons, the bookstore clerk, every stranger she'd passed. Had they been watching her? Had her brief taste of freedom exposed her to something worse than captivity? Double the security. Caleb's voice allowed no argument. No one gets near her. No one. She's going to ask questions. Let her ask. She's not getting answers that put her in more danger. Grace felt anger rising hot in her throat. She was tired of being a thing to be protected, a problem to be managed, a debt to be paid through isolation. She stood up, stepped into the hallway, let herself be seen. I'm already in danger. Everyone turned. Caleb's expression went through several emotions too fast to track before settling on something between fury and concern. Grace! Don't! She descended the stairs, her leg shaking but her voice steady. Don't send me away. Don't lie to me. Just tell me what's happening. Caleb looked at Richard, at Hayes, some silent conversation happening between men who'd worked together long enough to speak without words. Then he gestured toward his office. Everyone else out. Richard and Hayes left. Grace followed Caleb into a room she'd never entered before. It was exactly what she'd expect. Dark wood, leather chairs, windows that overlooked grounds that looked peaceful and weren't. He poured himself a drink, didn't offer her one. You shouldn't have been listening, he said. You shouldn't have taken me prisoner. I saved your life. You buried me alive. Grace felt something breaking open inside her, all the weeks of silence cracking like ice. And now you're telling me that even here, behind all your walls and guards and violence, I'm not safe. Then what's the point? Caleb drank, slow and deliberate. When he spoke, his voice carried exhaustion that went deeper than lack of sleep. There are people in this city who want what I have. Territory, money, power. For years, we've maintained balance. They stay in their corners. I stay in mine. But someone got ambitious. Started making moves into neighborhoods we control. So you killed them. They killed us first. That's how this works. And now they know about me. It wasn't a question. Yes. What do they think I am to you? Caleb set down his glass, looked at her with an intensity that made Grace feel exposed, like he could see every thought she'd had about him, every moment she'd softened toward him, every time she'd looked at him and thought about what might happen if things were different. They think you matter to me, he said quietly, and they are not wrong. The admission hung in the air between them. Grace felt her heart doing complicated things, felt the anger and fear tangling with something else, something she didn't want to name. I don't want to matter to you, she said. I want to go back to my life. What life? The one where you were drowning, where you watched your grandmother die and couldn't afford to save her. It was mine. It was killing you. Slowly, the American dream turned nightmare. Work yourself to death and die in debt anyway. At least here, you're alive. Am I? Grace's voice broke despite herself. Or am I just a better preserved corpse? Caleb moved toward her, slow, like approaching something that might run. He stopped close enough that Grace could see the gray threading through his dark hair, close enough to see the lines around his eyes that came from years of looking over his shoulder. I'm trying to protect you, he said. I never asked you to. No. You asked me to honor your grandmother's dying wish. And that's what I'm doing. Eleanor asked me to remember what we had, what I lost. You're all that's left of her. If I let something happen to you, if I let this world that destroyed us destroy you too, then what was any of it for? Grace felt tears burning hot behind her eyes. I'm not her. I'm not your second chance or your redemption or your way of making peace with the past. I'm just a person who wants to live my own life, even if that life is hard. Then live it here. For now. Until this is over. When will it be over? Caleb's expression told her everything before he spoke. I don't know. Grace stepped back, putting distance between them, between his gravity and her orbit. So I'm here forever. That's what you're saying. Until you decide otherwise. Until your enemies are dead or you are. Until some version of safety exists that might never come. Better imprisoned and breathing than free and dead. You don't know that. You don't know which I'd choose. I won't let you choose. And there it was. The truth that had been hiding under all the pretty words about protection and honor. Caleb wouldn't let her leave because Caleb didn't let anything go. Not her grandmother 40 years ago and not Grace now. He collected the things he loved and locked them away where the world couldn't touch them, where they couldn't choose differently, where they couldn't leave him. Grace felt something inside her harden into resolve. Then you're no different from them, she said. The people trying to help me. You're all just men who think they can own things that were never theirs to begin with. She left his office before he could respond, walked back through the house that was both sanctuary and prison, climbed the stairs to her room. Behind her, she heard nothing. No footsteps following. No voice calling her back. Just silence, the kind that comes when you've said something true enough that nobody can argue with it. In her room, Grace went to the window. Outside, guards patrolled grounds that looked peaceful and weren't. Somewhere in Philadelphia, people were dying over territory and money and pride. And she was here, in a mansion, in a cage, protected and powerless and so tired of being both. She thought about her grandmother, about Eleanor who'd chosen freedom over love and lived with that choice for 40 years. She thought about what it cost to leave, what it cost to stay, how sometimes both options felt like different flavors of drowning. Grace pressed her forehead against the cold glass and made a decision. She didn't know how yet. She didn't know when. But she was going to find a way out of this gilded cage, even if it meant risking everything Caleb was trying to protect her from. Before we close this chapter, take a moment, like, comment, subscribe, and check the description box below. Every small gesture helps the next story find its way to you. Because living Skade was still living. And that was more than she'd been doing here. The house changed after that night. Or maybe Grace changed and the house stayed the same, but the space between them widened into something she couldn't ignore anymore. She saw the guards differently now, not as protection but as barriers. Saw Richard's polite inquiries as surveillance. Saw every locked door and monitored phone call as evidence of captivity she'd been too comfortable to acknowledge. Caleb avoided her, or she avoided him. The result was the same. Days passed where they existed in the same space without occupying it together. Grace took her meals in her room, spent hours in the library reading books she couldn't remember, walked the grounds under the watchful eyes of men who called protection but looked like prison guards. She thought about escape constantly, mapped the grounds in her mind, counted the guards, timed their rotations. The walls were high but not impossible. The gates opened regularly for deliveries, for Caleb's comings and goings, for the ordinary traffic of running a mansion that fronted for an empire. There were moments, brief windows, when escape might be possible. But possible wasn't the same as survivable. Because Caleb had been right about one thing, his enemies knew about her now. Walking out those gates might mean walking into something worse than what she was leaving. Grace hated that he was right. Hated that her anger at him was complicated by the awareness that his paranoia wasn't unfounded. People had died in a shipping yard. 3 of his, 2 of theirs, bodies in the mathematics of urban warfare. And somewhere out there were men who'd use her to get to him, who'd hurt her just to send a message, who'd see her not as a person but as leverage. She'd gone from drowning in American poverty to drowning in American violence, and she couldn't figure out which was worse. It was a week after their confrontation when Caleb finally sought her out. Grace was in the library, pretending to read, when he appeared in the doorway. He looked different, tired in a way she hadn't seen before, something worn at the edges of him. "We need to talk," he said. "Do we?" "Grace, I don't have anything to say to you." He entered anyway, sat in the chair across from her, the fireplace between them doing nothing to warm the cold that had settled into the space they occupied. "The situation's gotten worse," he said without preamble. "The people making moves against us, they are not backing down. 2 more incidents this week. A warehouse, one of our restaurants. They are escalating." Grace set down her book. "What does that have to do with me?" "Everything. They are trying to get to me through people who matter. Family, inner circle. And they think you're part of that. But I'm not. Aren't you?" The question sat heavy between them. Grace thought about the past weeks, about how her understanding of Caleb had shifted from captor to something more complicated, about how she'd started seeing him not as a villain but as a man shaped by violence who didn't know how to be anything else. "I don't want to be," she said quietly. "But you are, whether you want it or not." Caleb leaned forward, his expression intent. "I need to move you. Somewhere safer. Out of the city." Grace felt her stomach drop. "No, it's not negotiable." "Everything is negotiable. This is my life." "Your life is what I'm trying to save." Grace stood up, anger flooding hot through her veins. "By taking me further from everything I know? By isolating me more than I already am? When does protection become erasure, Caleb? When do I stop existing entirely?" "When you're dead." He stood too, matching her intensity. "You want to know what they'd do if they got their hands on you. You want me to describe in detail how they'd hurt you, how they'd use you, how they'd make sure I heard every scream. Because I can. I've seen it. I've done worse." The admission hit like a physical blow. Grace had known what he was, abstractly, but hearing him say it, hearing him admit to horrors he'd committed, made it real in a way it hadn't been before. "Get away from me," she said. "No. I said get away." "Make me." Caleb's voice was hard, challenging. "You want to leave? Want to walk out that door? Do it. See how far you get before reality catches up. Before the men watching this house, the men who've been taking photos of you, the men who know exactly what you mean to me even if you don't. See how far you get before they make you wish you'd stayed." Grace slapped him. The sound echoed in the quiet library. Her hand stung. Caleb's head turned with the impact, but his expression didn't change, didn't soften, didn't give her anything except the truth she didn't want. "I hate you," she said. "I know. You've ruined my life. I saved it. It wasn't yours to save." They stood there, inches apart, breathing hard, and Grace felt something shift in the air between them. Some charge that wasn't just anger, wasn't just fear, was something electric and dangerous and wrong in all the right ways. Caleb raised his hand slowly, like approaching a wounded animal, and touched her face where tears had started falling without her permission. His thumb brushed her cheek, gentle in a way that contradicted everything he was. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, "for all of it. For taking you, for keeping you, for caring about you when I have no right. But I won't apologize for keeping you alive." Grace closed her eyes against his touch, against the confusion of wanting to hit him and wanting something else entirely, something she wouldn't let herself name. "I can't live like this," she whispered. "I can't be this person, this thing you keep in a cage." "Then help me end it." Grace opened her eyes. "What?" Caleb stepped back, and Grace immediately felt the loss of his proximity, hated herself for feeling it. He walked to the window, looked out at grounds that were about to be abandoned. "The men coming after us, they think I'm weak. Think I've gotten soft in my age, that I care too much about civilian casualties, about keeping some version of peace in this city. They are not entirely wrong. But if we show them strength, real strength, we can end this. Fast and final. What does that mean? It means I draw them out. Make them come for me on my terms, in a place of my choosing. It means violence that ends the threat instead of prolonging it. It means more people die. Yes. Caleb turned to face her. But better them than you. Better anyone than you. Grace felt something in her chest crack open. Why? Why do I matter this much? You barely know me. I knew Eleanor. That's enough. No, it's not. It can't be. She was your past. I'm not responsible for redeeming it. Caleb crossed the room, slow and deliberate, until he was standing close enough that Grace could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the heat of him, close enough to be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with violence. You're right, he said. Eleanor is my past. But you, he stopped, seemed to be fighting some internal war about what to say next. You've become something else. Something I didn't plan for. Something that scares me more than all my enemies combined. What? Grace barely breathed the word. Someone I could actually lose. Before Grace could process what that meant, before she could decide if she wanted to run or stay or do something else entirely, there was a commotion from downstairs. Shouts. The sound of breaking glass. Then gunfire, sharp and immediate, tearing through the quiet house like reality cracking open. Caleb moved instantly. He grabbed Grace's wrist, pulled her toward a door she'd never noticed before hidden behind a bookshelf. Go. Now. There's a passage. Leads to the garage. What about you? I'm ending this. More gunfire. Closer now. Grace heard Hayes shouting orders, heard feet pounding through hallways, heard all the violence Caleb had been protecting her from coming through the front door like a flood. I'm not leaving you, Grace said. And she meant it, even though she didn't understand why, even though hours ago she'd hated him, even though everything was wrong and complicated and nothing made sense. Caleb looked at her with an expression Grace had never seen before. Then he kissed her, hard and desperate and tasting like goodbye. When he pulled away, his eyes were steel. Yes, you are. He pushed her through the hidden door and shut it before she could protest. Grace heard a lock engage. She was in darkness, in a passage that smelled like dust and fear, and on the other side of that door, the man who'd kept her prisoner was about to go to war. Grace felt her way through the passage, hands on cold walls, heart hammering against her ribs. She could still hear the gunfire, muffled now but constant, a rhythm like thunder that wouldn't stop. She thought about going back, about finding a way through that locked door, about refusing to be protected while Caleb fought her battles. But she kept moving forward instead, because he'd asked her to, because living was still living, even when it felt like cowardice. The passage ended at a metal door. Grace pushed through into a garage filled with cars that probably cost more than houses. Hayes was there, bleeding from somewhere on his arm, his expression grim. Get in, he said, gesturing to a black SUV. We're leaving. Caleb. Mr. Reeves knows what he's doing. Our job is getting you out. Grace climbed into the SUV. Hayes drove. The garage door opened onto a service road Grace had never seen before, leading away from the house toward trees, toward darkness, toward somewhere that wasn't here. As they drove, Grace turned to look back through the rear window. The mansion was lit up like a nightmare, smoke rising from one wing, shadows moving behind windows in patterns that looked like violence. Somewhere in that beautiful house, Caleb was fighting a war he'd started before she was born. And she was running from it, alive because he'd chosen her life over his own safety. If stories like this linger in your heart long after they end, don't leave just yet. Like, comment, subscribe, and check the description box below, and let the next story find you when the night grows quiet again. Grace pressed her hand against the glass, leaving a print that would evaporate as soon as the heat hit it, and watched her cage burn in the distance until the trees swallowed it whole. Hayes drove them to a safe house in the suburbs west of the city, One of those neighborhoods where every house looked identical and nobody asked questions about their neighbors. The kind of American anonymity that people pay extra for, where privacy meant pretending other people didn't exist. Grace sat on a couch in a living room that smelled like new paint and said nothing for 3 hours. Hayes made phone calls in another room, his voice low and urgent. Night turned to morning outside windows that showed streets empty of everything except the occasional dog walker and the rhythm of sprinklers watering lawns that were already too green. Her phone had been left behind. No way to contact anyone. No way to know what was happening back at the estate. Hayes wouldn't tell her anything except it's being handled, which told her nothing and everything at once. She kept seeing Caleb's expression before he locked her in that passage. Kept feeling his kiss, desperate and final. Kept hearing gunfire that might have been meant for him. Around dawn, the door opened. Grace's heart leaped before she saw it was Richard, not Caleb. His suit was dirty, torn at one shoulder. His face carried exhaustion that went deeper than one night without sleep. "Is he alive?" Grace asked before Richard could speak. "Yes." Richard sat down heavily in a chair across from her. "Injured but alive. Currently in a private facility receiving treatment." Grace felt something unclench in her chest. "How bad?" "Gunshot wound to the shoulder. Some cuts. Nothing life-threatening. He'll recover fully." "And the others?" "4 of our men dead. 7 of theirs. The house sustained significant damage. But the message was sent. The territory war is over." Grace processed this. 10 men dead. 4 families destroyed. All because someone got ambitious. Because power demanded constant defense. Because this was how America worked when you lived in the parts nobody talked about at dinner parties. "He wants to see you," Richard said. "When?" "Now. If you're willing." Grace thought about refusing. Thought about demanding to be taken back to South Philly, back to her empty apartment, back to the life she'd been living before all this started. But the truth was, that life didn't exist anymore. The apartment had probably been rented to someone else by now. Her few possessions donated or trashed. She'd been erased from that world as completely as if she'd never existed. "Take me to him," she said. They drove for 40 minutes, north into the suburbs that turned into actual countryside, into Pennsylvania that looked like postcards. The facility was hidden behind trees and gates, looking more like a resort than a hospital, which was probably the point. Richard led her through hallways that smelled like money and antiseptic. They stopped outside a door. He didn't go in, just gestured for Grace to enter alone. Caleb was sitting up in bed, his left shoulder heavily bandaged, wearing a hospital gown that looked wrong on him. His face was bruised, a cut above his eyebrow held together with butterfly closures. He looked human in a way Grace had never seen before. Mortal. Breakable. "You came," he said. "Richard said you wanted to see me." "I did. I do." Caleb shifted, winced. "Come here. Please." Grace approached the bed slowly, each step feeling like a choice she was making. She could still turn around, could still walk away, could still choose safety over whatever this was becoming. She sat in the chair next to the bed instead. They looked at each other for a long moment, and Grace felt time stretching strange between them, felt all the weeks of captivity and conflict and confusion settling into something she didn't have words for yet. "I'm sorry," Caleb said finally, "for all of it, for taking you, keeping you, putting you in danger. You were right. I was trying to own something that wasn't mine, trying to make up for losing Eleanor by holding on to you." "Was?" Grace noticed the past tense. "Is. I'm still doing it. Even now. I want to tell you that you need to stay protected, that you can't go back to your old life, that the men who came after us might have friends who'll try again. But that's not really about your safety. That's about me not wanting to let you go." Grace felt her throat tighten. "Why?" "Because somewhere in the past weeks, you stopped being Eleanor's granddaughter and became yourself. And He stopped, looked away, looked back. "I care about you. The real you, not the memory I was chasing." You don't know the real me. Don't I? I know you'd rather drown in debt than be saved if the cost is your freedom. I know you slap people who deserve it. I know you read murder mysteries but never finish them because you'd rather imagine your own endings. I know you miss your grandmother more than you'll admit because grief feels like indulgence when you're trying to survive. I know you. Grace felt tears burning behind her eyes. She hated that he was right, hated that he'd seen her clearly while she was busy seeing him as just her captor. What happens now? She asked. That depends on you. The threat is neutralized. The house is being repaired. You can go back there if you want. Or I can set you up somewhere else. An apartment in Center City. Money for school if you want to finish your degree. Whatever you need to build the life you want. He paused. Or you can leave entirely. I'll make sure you're protected, watched from a distance, but free to live however you choose. Just like that, after weeks of telling me I couldn't leave. I almost died last night. When you're lying on the floor bleeding, wondering if this is it, you think about what matters. And what mattered wasn't protecting Eleanor's memory. It was knowing I'd taken away your choice, your life, for my own selfish reasons. Grace stood up, walked to the window. Outside, the grounds were pretty and peaceful, the kind of scene they'd put in a brochure for expensive recovery. She thought about freedom, real freedom, the kind she'd been fighting for since the night her grandmother died. It was right there, being offered. All she had to do was take it. But freedom, she'd learned, wasn't just about leaving. It was about choosing what you walked toward. She turned back to Caleb. I want to see the house. The real house. Not as a prisoner, but as someone who chooses to be there. Grace. Let me finish. You've been making all the choices. Where I live, when I eat, if I can leave. Now it's my turn. She crossed back to the bed, stood close enough to see the gold flecks in his eyes clearly. I'll come back to the house, but on my terms. I come and go as I please. I have my own money, my own life. And if I decide to stay, it's because I want to, not because you won't let me leave. And if you decide to go, then I go, and you let me. Caleb studied her face, some war playing out behind his eyes. Then he nodded, once, slow and deliberate. Okay, he said. Your terms. You mean it? I mean it. I'm tired of being the villain in your story. I'd rather see what happens if I'm not. Grace felt something shift inside her, some fundamental change in how she saw him, saw herself, saw the possibility of what they might become if given the chance. She'd come here expecting to say goodbye. But goodbye felt like giving up on something that hadn't fully formed yet, some potential that scared her and pulled at her in equal measure. She reached out, took his hand. His fingers were warm, human, alive. She thought about him bleeding on a floor somewhere, thought about the kiss he'd given her before locking her away to safety, thought about how protection and control looked the same until you examined the intention behind them. Heal, she said. Then we'll figure out what comes next. Together. Grace didn't answer immediately. She thought about her grandmother, about Eleanor who'd chosen to leave and lived with that choice for 40 years. She thought about the alternative, staying with someone who loved wrong but was trying to love right. She thought about how in America, in life, sometimes there were no perfect choices, just ones you could live with. Together, she said finally. For now. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't forever. But it was a choice, and it was hers, and that made all the difference. 3 months passed. The house was repaired, the bullet holes patched, the bloodstains removed from hardwood floors until you'd never know violence had happened there. But Grace knew. She walked those holes differently now, aware of what they'd survived, what they'd witnessed, what they'd paid for in lives and choices and all the gray areas between right and wrong. She came and went as she pleased, like Caleb promised. Some mornings she woke in the mansion, in her room that no longer felt like a cell. Other nights she stayed in the apartment Caleb had bought her in Northern Liberties, one of those converted loft spaces with exposed brick and windows that overlooked the city she was learning to love again. She enrolled in community college, finishing the degree she'd abandoned when her parents died. English literature, because she liked stories, liked understanding why people did what they did when the world pushed them into corners. Her classmates were younger, mostly, kids who didn't know what real struggle looked like yet. Grace didn't judge them for it. She remembered being young enough to believe the world owed you something. Caleb healed slowly. The shoulder wound left a scar he didn't bother hiding. He moved differently now, careful with that arm, reminded daily of his own mortality. They had dinner together twice a week, sometimes at the mansion, sometimes at restaurants in the city where people pretended not to know who he was. They talked about small things mostly, her classes, his businesses, the Phillies' disappointing season, the way Philadelphia smelled different in winter than summer.